Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. If you're new to my channel, my name is Melissa and I'm a nursing student. So today's video is going to be focused on my experience doing my mental health clinical at Chamberlain University. If you've not seen my previous videos, then you may or may not know that I attend Chamberlain University's evening and weekend BSN program, and I am obtaining my bachelor's degree in nursing. I'm currently in my final week of my mental health course, and just like most schools, just like all schools actually, Chamberlain's nursing courses have two components, and that is the didactic portion, which is the lecture, and then there's the clinical, where you actually go to facilities like hospitals, rehab centers, and you're getting hands-on experience working directly with patients. And so mental health is no different. I had my didactic portion, which I will focus on in my next video, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going to just be talking about my experience doing my clinical rotation. This clinical only had 48 clinical hours that we had to do. So if you've not seen my previous videos and you don't know the layout of Chamberlain's nursing program is accelerated. So instead of traditional 16-week semesters, our classes are condensed into 8-week sessions. So mental health was no different. I only took mental health, or I'm only taking mental health because I'm still in it, for 8 weeks. And I do my clinicals on the weekends since I'm in the evening and weekend program. And mental health clinicals only 48 hours. Now in the past, I've had clinicals that required many more clinical hours. Mental health only had 48, or they only required 48. And my mental health clinicals were 12-hour clinicals. So of course, if you do the math, that means that I only had a clinical 4 times or 4 weeks out of the 8-week session. And so one thing that I kept trying to find out before I actually got to mental health was, what do I do on the off weeks? Are we expected to do some type of like at-home assignment or some type of like online clinical? You're not. So for this clinical, I would only have to go to clinical every other week. So 4 weeks out of the 8 weeks, of course. And then on my off weeks where I did not have to go to clinical, I did not have any additional work to do. So it's literally just the 48 hours that you're actually in clinical. So even though I had 4 days of clinical that I had to do this session, I did not actually go to the hospital 4 times. I only went to the hospital 3 times, and that is because we had sim lab. So I think I've detailed what sim lab is in my previous videos. Just in case you're unfamiliar, sim lab is, instead of going to your clinical site, you actually go to campus, and they have something called a sim lab where they have different rooms that are like mock hospital rooms. They have mock patients, which are actually very high-tech mannequins, and the room is decorated just like a hospital room. The mannequin is in a hospital gown. The mannequin is somewhat interactive. They have a heartbeat. They can breathe. They blink. Like, they're very realistic. And when you go to sim lab, depending on what class you take, you go in, you kind of get a bedside report from the person running the sim lab, like what's going on with the patient, what medications they're taking, and then you go into the room and a scenario plays out. So there's a mirror in the room. It looks like a mirror, but it's like a two-way glass where your professor and the sim lab coordinator, they're watching you while you are acting out the scenario, just to see what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, and to interact with you through the patient. And also you're being recorded. So there's a camera in the room that's watching everything that you're doing. The scenario plays out, and then after that, you and your cohort and your professor go with the sim lab instructor to a separate room where you're able to watch the entire scenario that you just did, and you debrief to figure out what you did right, what you could do better next time, and things like that. So the very first week of my clinical, I did not go to the hospital. I went to campus and did sim lab. And because I never want to cheat or anything like that, I'm not going to let you guys know what the scenario was. But obviously, if I'm taking mental health, the scenario that we did in sim lab had to do with mental health. So that's all that I'll say. Now, of course, if you're a nursing student and you're at Chamberlain, then you know sim lab does not take a full 12 hours. So we went to campus. Since that was our very first day of clinical, we met our instructor. We went into a classroom, and she kind of went over the syllabus and what was expected of us and what we were allowed to do and not allowed to do in clinical. Then we did the simulation, we did the debriefing, and that only took a few hours. After that, we had lunch, and then we came back together and we went over different skills and things like that to make up for the 12 hours. And then when we went home, we had documentation we had to do. So after the sim lab day, we had a week off since we went to the hospital every other week, and then we had our first week in the hospital. Now, before I start talking about my experience actually in the hospital, I do want to say a few things. Number one, I am not going to detail any patients, of course. In all of my videos where I've talked about my experience in the hospital and at different clinical sites, I have never disclosed any private patient information, and obviously I'm not going to do that in this video. But in previous videos, I have said things that I have been able to do in the hospital. Like I've mentioned, oh, I got to administer this medication, I got to do wound care, I got to help remove a Foley catheter, an indwelling Foley catheter, things like that. In this video, I'm going to be even less detailed about what we did in the hospital setting, because to be honest, we really did not get to do much hands-on stuff. To be honest, this clinical was more observational in my opinion. We were not even able to look at patient charts, and I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure that the reason is that they didn't want us to have preconceived notions of patients before we actually got to meet and interact with them. So they didn't want us to know that a patient had a certain mental disorder, and then we'd already have a preconceived notion of what that patient was going to be like. We might be scared, and then we don't really get to fully engage with them once we got onto the unit. And looking back, I agree with this decision, and I'm happy that this was the way that they did things. I don't know if that was Chamberlain's policy or if that was the facility that we were at, that we were not allowed to actually look through patient charts. But I have my own experience with mental health. Thank God I don't have any mental health issues or anything like that. But I have had loved ones that did. And I will just say there's definitely some negative stereotypes surrounding mental health, even within the healthcare community. Some of the things that I've heard nursing students and even nurses and physicians say about patients on mental health units have been really ugly. And I'm really happy that I had a positive experience doing my mental health rotation, because even though I didn't have preconceived notions going into this clinical, some of my cohort definitely did. I heard people were just kind of scared just because they didn't know what they were walking into. They didn't know what they were going to experience. And at least for my clinical group, by the time we had our last day, people who were hesitant to go into this clinical left it saying that they may want to go into mental health when they graduate. Like they want to specialize in mental health. And I'm somebody who, when I graduate, I think I would like to go into mental health. I'm still not 100% sure what specialty I want to go into, but I think right now, critical care and mental health are at the top of my list just because I had such a positive experience in this clinical site. And so I say all that to say, if you're a nursing student, if you're about to go to nursing school, if you are somebody who maybe doesn't have any experience working with or being around people that have mental health disorders, don't let other people scare you, because it may not be as bad as they're making it out to be. And just because somebody may have had a negative experience once or at one facility doesn't mean that that is what the entire specialty is like. Hey guys, sorry if the lighting looks totally different and if things just look different. I actually just took a break from filming because, speaking of mental health, I just had therapy. And so now I am coming back to finish this video, and the sun has gone down, or it's starting to go down. So for continuity purposes, I apologize. So now to talk about the actual in the hospital clinical, I thought that I was going to be going to, or that we were going to be going to a facility that was like 100% for mental health and for psych patients. And that was not the case. We actually went to a regular hospital, and then our clinical was done on one of the units in the hospital that focused on psych care. All of the patients were inpatient, which means that they didn't go home in the evenings. They slept there, and they were there for, a lot of them were there for a few days. Some of them were there like up to a week. Some patients were there longer. It just depends on what people are dealing with. And we were not able to view the chart. So we went into the hospital. We would listen to the nurses giving report, whatever information they exchanged. We did hear that, but we were not allowed to like shift through the chart and look through the chart. Of course, a lot of the patients were really open about their conditions or their illnesses, so we could kind of see, and we learned what each patient had if they were willing to share it. So the unit that we were on actually had two parts that were completely separate, but one side of the unit was for adults and then the other side of the unit was for adolescents. So we got to have our mental health clinical and we got to work with both sets of patients, which I thought was really cool and really interesting. They had different challenges, which was awesome because we got to actually see and interact with people that had the illnesses that we're learning about in lecture. So in terms of what we actually did in the clinical on a day-to-day basis, since we were not reviewing the patient's charts and we actually were not administering medication, was we would go in, we would listen to the nurses giving report, and we would get as much information as we could from that alone. And then we would watch the nurses make the schedule for the day, and each day consisted of different group therapy, individual therapy, art therapy, music therapy, just a whole bunch of different therapeutic techniques that are used to help the patients alongside their medication. So each day started off with group therapy, and patients would talk about the struggles that they were having in the moment, like whether or not they were able to sleep well, how they were reacting to their medication. If they didn't feel like sharing that in the group setting, they shared that privately during their assessment. And then they would talk about their goals for the day and their goals for their time there. And it was really cool because since it was a group setting, each person had their time to speak. When the other patients were not speaking, everyone was pretty respectful to the ones that were speaking, and everyone was given a chance to give positive feedback. So it was really interesting to see how the patients were also a part of their own therapy, just because they were so supportive of each other, and all the patients on the unit were just one big support system. And then in addition to that, the floor had nurses and counselors on it. The counselors were the ones that were leading the group therapy sessions. A nurse practitioner also would come in and do assessments on the patients just to evaluate their mental health, to evaluate how their medications were affecting them mentally and physically, whether or not they were working, whether or not their dosages needed to be adjusted. And so we were really lucky that there's an amazing nurse practitioner on the unit that allowed us to sit in those sessions. And one really big thing I've learned about mental health, we learn this a lot in the didactic portion of the class, and then you get to see it applied in clinical, was that a big portion of mental health is patient choice. And of course, patient choice and body autonomy is important in any specialty of nursing, but particularly in mental health, it is extremely, extremely important. And so it was really interesting because the nurse practitioner allowed us to sit down on the assessment, but of course, first they would have to ask the patient, are you okay if the nursing student sits in? And we were kind of able to talk to the patients as much as they allowed us to. So there was a big focus on body autonomy, a big focus on patient choice. And it was really interesting seeing how the patients played such a heavy role in their care versus when you're in the hospital on different units. My last clinical rotation was in the ICU, and a lot of my patients were either intubated or they were not able to talk. So usually when I'm kind of in the hospital setting, I see the family members being advocates for patients. In this setting, I really saw the patients getting to advocate for themselves, which I thought was really cool. So the clinical work this session was also different. In previous clinicals, we would have a lot of paperwork to do. Thankfully, in this clinical, we did not have any of that. All that we were responsible for with this clinical was our weekly reflection, and then we had our packet that we had to fill out, which you do for every clinical at Chamberlain, which on a week-to-week basis, you write what you've learned, what you did. So it's kind of like a mini reflection, things you want to improve on, and then we had to write a blurb for our midterm and a blurb for our final. But in addition to that packet, we had a reflection and we had to upload it within 24 hours. And the reflection was just detailing what we learned, what we did, and how the didactic portion of the class is being incorporated in clinical. So in terms of my experience doing mental health clinicals, that's pretty much it. In terms of the work, as I just mentioned, it's a lot less heavy in terms of like the handwritten work than my previous clinicals. The experience was incredible. I really, really enjoyed this clinical site. I enjoyed the nurses that I got to work with, especially the counselors I got to work with. They were so skilled. And after this experience, it made me feel like mental health is definitely a specialty that I want to look into when I graduate. Next session, I will be taking pediatrics, which I'm not super looking forward to. I think of all the clinical rotations, pediatrics is the one I'm looking forward to the least. But I always tell you guys to keep an open mind when going to clinical rotations. So I'm doing my best to keep an open mind. You never know, I may go into pediatric clinical and I may love it. but I am excited because I'm going to be working in the emergency department for clinical next session. So even though I'll be working with pediatrics, I will be in the emergency department, which I have always wanted to do clinical in. So I'm hoping that I will get a lot out of that rotation. So that is it for this video. If you've made it to the end, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.